Good day, young philosophers, and welcome to another video in this series on Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. And in this video, we're going to take a look at examples of virtues of character, otherwise known as moral virtues, right? And the moral virtues are very interesting to us because the moral virtues fundamentally have to do with the kinds of actions and feelings that are common to all people as people. Like, not everyone wants to be a guitar player. Not everyone wants to be a basketball player. Not everyone even wants to be a mathematician or intellectual. And the kind of virtues that are virtues of skill like those are unique to people who are interested in those particular talents. However, here with the virtues of characters, all people, no matter who you are, partake in these kinds of actions and these feelings. And it's really, these virtues of character differ according to actions and feelings. Here, let me get myself out of the way here. I'll shrink myself down now, right? Here I am. Hello. But moral virtues fundamentally differ with regard to what I'll call their domain, the kinds of feelings or actions that are unique to that kind of virtue that give rise to the need of having some virtue, okay? So let's take a look at examples. First of all, most of the examples that we're going to look at here really do show up in Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. In particular, we're going to look at some examples from book 2, chapter 7, but they actually, if you really want to get some more details, especially about virtues like bravery and temperance and things like that, dig into books 3 and books 4 and you see some beautiful stuff there, the end of book 3 and all of book 4. But anyway, so let's look at some examples of moral virtues, right? So here, just a quick snapshot of book 2, chapter 7, where we see Aristotle very quickly just delineate several different virtues and corresponding vices. One of the things that we had talked about very briefly, I just mentioned, and we'll actually dig into it more right now, that virtues fundamentally are sort of this mean between extremes, this middle between two extremes. So the virtuous person is someone who sort of finds just the right way of doing the thing at the right time, at the right moment, and with the right people and the right respect. And it's always sort of this in between two extremes. So we're going to look at virtues like bravery, temperance, generosity, and there's plenty more that we'll talk about. And they're always going to be this sort of middle between two different things, right? So let's start with just a handful of these. We'll only go through about 4 of them, but let's take a look here. First, let's talk about a virtue that you can see. Maybe you could guess what it is. This is a little picture of a scene from the movie Saving Private Ryan, which I think is a beautiful film because of how it exemplifies this particular virtue. But that virtue is the virtue that deals with confidence in fear, right? All of us have to deal with fear. Right now, perhaps more than others, a lot of people are fearful because of something like having to stay inside, and we're afraid of getting sick or what's going to happen to people we love, you know? So we deal with a lot of fearful circumstances. Now, Aristotle will say the fundamental place that you'll see a cause of fear is in war, but this can be analogous in all kind of instances. So what would you call the virtue for someone who has to have confidence in the face of fear? Well, you might guess courage or maybe bravery. Bravery is how Arwin translates in our text, but bravery is the sort of in between. Now, there's 2 ways to not be brave. You could either be brave because of some deficiency, right? Oops, and for you that would be over here, some deficiency, or because of some excess, right? And so, okay, what are we talking about? If you're not brave, you might call someone a coward. And that's probably the first thing that comes to mind because the coward has some deficiency in terms of confidence in the face of fear. The opposite extreme, there is a vice of excess that people who aren't brave sometimes are rash, right? And they'd be the kind of people that act too quickly and have too much confidence in the face of fear. The virtue is having just the right amount. In a film like Saving Private Ryan, which is awesome, you start to see many, many different characters who exemplify either virtue, this middle path, or you see cowardice, or you see rashness. And definitely it's a movie worth watching. It's definitely not an easy movie to watch all the time, but it's definitely a powerful one. I recommend you check it out. So that's one example. Now let's think of something else. Whoops, I think we went backwards. You might try to guess if you look down here what kind of virtue we might be dealing with there. And this would be a virtue that has to do with us giving to benefit others, right? And what would we call the virtue of someone giving to benefit others? Well, you might guess that would be generosity. We talked a little bit about generosity in our last video, right? And all the ways that someone might end up not being generous. Why might someone not be generous? Well, perhaps they don't fully understand how to be generous to a person in this circumstance. Perhaps they just don't have the right kind of character to act on their knowledge, right? But now if we just look in terms of characters here, right? How is how is generosity mean between extremes? Well, in one extreme, you probably think of first would be the vice of stinginess, right? And on the opposite extreme, we might call that wastefulness. Now, interestingly, stinginess, Aristotle saves that for as a vice for another virtue, but I like to use the word here, and so we'll just go with it. Now, when you think of a stingy person, you might think of someone like the Scrooge, who just isn't willing to give to people, like, bah, humbug, this stuff's mine, you can't have any. But what do we mean by wasteful? Sometimes when we see wastefulness, it's not really what we think it is, right? In other words, sometimes what we think is generosity ends up being kind of wasteful. Why? If you give so much to someone that it doesn't actually benefit others, then Aristotle will say that's not really a virtuous, good, kalon, beautiful action at all. That's just wastefulness. So like there was a show on MTV that some of my students have talked about in previous classes, and it was called My Super Sweet 16. And I'm not judging, but in some ways, yeah, I actually am judging just a little bit, where you have these parents throw these extravagant parties for their children. And there's nothing wrong with having a beautiful, wonderful party. But just like in this image here, I just did a quick Google search, and it's like this person having this pink stretch limo for their Sweet 16. I don't even know. But I mean, I don't know. Is that really terrible? No. I mean, I'm not really judging this particular person in this instance. I don't really know what's going on there, but I can see how it would be. There is a situation where someone could give something that's so extravagant that actually makes the person worse, turns them into a kind of person who just isn't ultimately good. They don't enjoy good things. They just desire more, becoming perhaps more and more entitled, or more and more just grasping possessions and desiring all possessions, and that's kind of ruining the person. I think you can ruin someone through the kind of gifts that you give, right? And so that would be kind of wastefulness on that extreme. Let's look at something else. Let's say we're talking about, just looking at these things is making me hungry, all right? This here we're going to be talking about this is actually kind of an action and a feeling where we think about bodily pleasures, right? The bodily pleasures. Now, bodily pleasures come in lots of different kinds. There's the bodily pleasures of like eating and drinking and sex and all kinds of stuff. And actually, we might break down some of these words in those categories. But a word that you guys might not necessarily use, but the word is temperance, right? And temperance is the virtue Aristotle talks about that governs people who enjoy the bodily pleasures in exactly the right way. They enjoy the bodily pleasures at the right time, the right place, with the right people, and the right respects and all that, right? And so I'm going to do this more in context of food, but you can do it in anything else. Now, what are these extremes, right? Well, it's probably difficult for us to think of the vice of deficiency, right? But for lack of a better word, we could call it insensibility, someone who doesn't enjoy pleasures the way that they ought, right? The opposite extreme, you might talk about the vice of excess, and that's probably the one we're more accustomed to, and that would be self-indulgence, where you just sort of engross yourself in bodily pleasures, right? And so to think about this, like there is a possible way to be temperate. There is a possible way to enjoy the right things in the right way at the right time, right? What do we mean by self-indulgence? It's the kind of person who, if we think about food, they just overeat. Like I like this video. It's not a video, it's a picture. I encountered her on the internet. I don't remember when it was, but this girl who says like, yes, I'll just have one slice of pizza, and it's this absolutely absurd slice of pizza. That seems like self-indulgence to me. That's not really, eating in the right way. The opposite extreme would be someone who refuses to enjoy any pleasures, right? Let's think about it in terms of something else, say like sex, right? If we're talking about sex, if like someone was like in a married, committed, loving relationship, but didn't, like for whatever reason, wouldn't have sex with their partner, that is a kind of vice of deficiency. That's what Aristotle is perhaps talking about as insensibility. Perhaps that could be prudishness, right? The opposite extreme, well, you can imagine, there's even self-indulgence that could happen in like say two people who loved each other, who are married and stuff like that. You could actually have still too much of something like sex or something like that. And then temperance is really the middle route, right? Now, it's not just a matter of quantity, though. And that's a very important thing to think about, because when we talk about enjoying the bodily pleasures and enjoying them in the right way, it doesn't just mean how much, but it's where, with whom, and all that kind of stuff, right? So if you were to have a slice of pizza, having a slice of pizza is great, but having a slice of pizza, like say in the middle of class, that's inappropriate. And if you desire bodily pleasure so much that you have to do that, then that's not necessarily right, so that doesn't work. And if we're just thinking about food, you could think of maybe the vice of deficiency might be something like anorexia or something like that, which is for us more of a medical condition, but maybe there's also this lack of character and this sort of vice to think about there too. I think I've got one more example. This is a nice one. What kind of virtue might I be talking about here? What are we dealing with here? Well, Aristotle talks about virtues in many different respects. They aren't just necessarily these moral virtues in terms of right and wrong in the same way that you always think of. You could, I forgot to change this word. It says giving to benefit others. That's so silly. I could start this video over, but I'm not going to. The actual action that we're talking about here is the action of humor, of being funny and humorous and bringing humor into life. So even though that says giving to benefit others, cross that out. I'm sorry. I could redo this, but I just don't feel like it. I'm just getting it done. So whatever. What's the virtue here? Well, Aristotle will say the virtue connected to this is called wittiness, like a very witty person. And for me, it was kind of tough for me to come up with good examples for each of these things. But in some ways, I think George Carlin, the guy in the middle, he maybe goes to excess just a little bit there too. That might be a little problematic. But George Carlin, amazingly funny guy, amazingly clever and insightful kind of comedian, and definitely worth checking out. If you don't know who he is, I feel bad for you. Check him out. I don't always agree with everything that he says, but I have to take what he says seriously. That's sort of like Aristotle and talking about opinions in general. There's some people's opinions that you should take seriously, even if you don't agree with them, because you have to reflect what is the truth within them. And I think George Carlin has that, in addition to just being gosh darn funny, right? Vice of deficiency and excess. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Well, there's Ben Stein, who played his history, I think it was history professor or something like that. And he purposefully just sits there and starts talking about economics. And he's purposefully in one of those boring moments of life. And that's sort of this vice that I'll call boorishness, that someone can't find any levity or humor in a moment that probably deserves some. And I mean, I know that you guys appreciate a teacher who can be at least a little bit funny sometimes, and I do my best to be somewhat humorous. And it's one of the weird things about teaching online here is there's less give and take. There's less chances of me being funny. I don't know if I'm ever really funny. At least my attempts to be funny are sometimes funny, even if the actual humor itself is not. I don't know. That's a little bit too meta for now. But anyways, Ben Stein right there is kind of a bore. The opposite extreme, the vice of excess, that's I tend to call that buffoonery, right? It's a great word. It's someone who's just a buffoon. It's someone who's trying to be too funny in the inappropriate times, and it just makes a fool of themselves. And so I don't know if you're familiar with this guy right there. Oh my gosh! All of a sudden his name is escaping me. Why can't I think of it? As soon as I stop this video, I'm going to think of it. But maybe he got a bad rap. He got in some trouble a while back for being inappropriately funny. So I mean, comedians need to toe the line of appropriateness in terms of humor, but at the same time, he kind of comes across as a buffoon sometimes to me, ever so often. What the heck is the guy's name? I'm drawing a blank. It's killing me. And you're like yelling at your screen right now, trying to tell me the guy's name, and I can't think of it. And it's on the tip of my tongue. And I feel like if I just keep rambling here for a minute, I'll think of it. I don't know. But anyway, these are just some examples of moral virtues for us to think about. I hope this is helpful. We're going to see one more video here now on virtue and Aristotle, and we'll take a look at talking about how someone becomes virtuous, what is ultimately leads to someone becoming virtuous. So hang in there and have a beautiful day. Catch you on the flip side.